is our last program of the Civil War Symposium, the American Civil War and Life in Southwest Missouri. And this one is the Civil War in Music and Memory. Just so you know, if you missed the others, they are posted on the library's YouTube channel, so you can always see it. And you will be able to see this one, or tell your friends who missed this one, that it will be posted in a couple of days. We also invite you to come back for some future library programs. One that, if you love history and the Ozarks, you'll enjoy. It's Ozarks Hillbilly, Stereotype, and Reality. And that's Thursday, February 10th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. in the Library Center auditorium. So, and you can always pick up a copy of Bookends, which my department puts out. And it's a schedule of all the things that are coming up. Thank you for wearing your masks at this event, and I'm reminding you to put your phones on silent or turn them off out of respect for our performers. And now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. James Baumlin. He's an MSU professor, and he's the magician who put all of this program together.
Can you hear me? Okay? I want to thank Kathleen Odell and the Library Center for welcoming us. This is an important occasion for us all. It gives us a different perspective on the Civil War, on the ways in which music was incorporated into our experience of this nation-changing event. I have put on screen here for you some images that are taken from a book that we are basing these readings on for the most part. You shall see the book's cover in a second, but allow me to go over my own thank yous. Beyond the Springfield-Greene County Library District, I would like to thank my colleagues in the music department, the Ozark Studies Institute at Missouri State, for allowing us to publish and for promoting the publication of We Gave Them Thunder, Marmaduke's Raid and the Civil War in Missouri and Arkansas, by my colleagues William Garrett Piston and John C. Rutherford. There is the book. Let me say that Dr. Piston is with us today, and he will be reading from the book. Unfortunately, John C. Rutherford is under the weather. He would have joined us in some readings, but Dr. Piston will take his place. Ethan Stahl, the individual who was playing the piano for us, very ably, I might say. He is a graduate student in keyboard performance at Missouri State, and I think that you guys will be very appreciative of the knowledge that he brings, the musical knowledge, as well as the art in his fingertips. Yes, Ann Marie Daehn, my colleague in music, is a mezzo-soprano who makes Stephen Foster sound bird-like and cloud-like. And my other colleague, baritone Chris Thompson, is going to pull the heartstrings in a different direction. Both of them are my admired collaborators in this event. So the sheet music that I'm going to go through very quickly demonstrates not just the varieties of experiences and the different people writing about the events of Wilson's Creek, of the First Battle of Springfield, of Blue Ridge, of the Second Battle. But what's important to note is that these events were recorded not just in the newspapers of the time, in Harper's Weekly, for example, but also in sheet music. And much of that sheet music has not been heard in the 21st century. Probably much of it was not heard in the 20th century. So to the extent that this particular event is going to be recorded, the odds are this will be a premier recording for much of the local Civil War music that we shall be listening to today. And I will just go very quickly through these slides to say these are examples of Southern sheet music aimed at persuading Missouri to join the Confederacy. And And you'll notice, well, each one of them is a story. I shall not tell that story today. This is an example of the music that was generated upon the death of General Lyon. You'll notice that he is lionized in vocal as well as in piano literature. The first general to have died, first Union general to have died in action in the Civil War. These are Southern examples of celebration of victory. So you have Oak Hill, which is the name that the Southerners used for the Battle of Springfield. So these are as significant to us as the Union examples that are tied to Franz Siegel's victory at Pea Ridge. So again, you'll notice I am showing you quite a few pieces of sheet music. Each one of these pieces is indeed tied to a war effort. This is a performance piece, a comic piece that was aimed at recruiting for Siegel. It's in German. It's German-American. I guess to fight mit Siegel, and it's an attempt to get German-Americans to sign up as his volunteers. Fremont, you all know the street named after him. He has some sheet music named after him as well. And is there a reason why this is not needed? What did I do?
You zoomed it out.
So how do I unzoom it? Can someone help? That's why we have graduate students. Where's the? I hear? Yeah.
I saw it.
If this messes things up, I'm sorry, I'll try to.
If he messes things up, it's his fault. Truly, I don't. And I just wanted to demonstrate that the war might be over, but it's not over, because here we have both Marmaduke and Price in their life afterwards, having marches still written about them. Okay. Stephen Foster, these are the pieces that we shall be listening to today. And this is my introduction to the events today, to our performance. Quote from Daniel Priest, who writes about Civil War music. When the war between the states broke out in 1861, the songwriters were ready. Pianos were well ensconced and polished by that time. There were 3 pianos in Springfield. There is some question as to whether there were 4. And one of the stories that you shall hear today is about one of the pianos that actually survives to this day in the History Museum on the square. The ingredients were and still are heroism, loss of loved ones, grieving mothers, wives and children, and men returning from battle, and the music you will hear today proves it. Stephen Foster really needs no introduction. The acknowledged father of American music. He mirrors those tastes. He reflects the sentiments of the nation both before and during the war. So his songs are about love, longing, family cares, friendships, loss, the nostalgia for the old homestead, patriotism in the midst of defeat, courage, resilience, hope despite of all. These are the subjects of his song lyrics. These will be the subjects of the music we shall hear now. With that, I ask that the program begin.
War of 1861-1865 is our nation's greatest tragedy. By the time it ended, some 750,000 soldiers had lost their lives, along with tens of thousands of civilians, male and female, white and black, slave and free. During the conflict, participants labeled the entire region west of the Mississippi the Trans-Mississippi Theater, but the major military operations were largely confined to Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. Missouri's importance is underscored by the fact that although it was the scene of very few large battles, when considering the war as a whole, Missouri was the third most fought over state. Virginia was first, Tennessee was second. When President Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, 7 southern states had already passed ordinances of secession and formed the Confederate States of America. After Confederate forces fired upon the Union garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, Lincoln called on the nation's governors to raise 75,000 militia to suppress what he considered to be a domestic insurrection. 5 additional slave states consequently left the Union, bringing the Confederate total to 11. These included Tennessee and Arkansas, which shared borders with Missouri, as did the Indian Territory, modern Oklahoma, which the Confederate government immediately tried to claim by negotiating treaties with Native Americans. Missouri also shared a border with Kentucky, whose pro-Confederate governor attempted to keep his state neutral, at least initially. Geography, therefore, condemned Missouri to be a major battleground. Federal troops set on restoring the Union would need to move through Missouri, as well as use the Mississippi River on its eastern border. In addition, the state had particularly valuable resources. It possessed the only significant railway system west of the Mississippi. St. Louis and nearby communities had hospitals and manufacturing facilities, along with docks and boat works to build and repair river craft, including the war's very first ironclads. Missouri was also home to the Granby Mines in Newton County, which on the eve of the Civil War produced more than 10 million pounds of lead annually. People constituted Missouri's greatest resource, however. In 1860, the census is revealing. Missouri's white population of just over 1 million was larger than that of any Confederate state, as was Missouri's white male population, which was almost 600,000. St. Louis ranked 8th among the nation's cities with a population of 161,000. It had almost 50,000 more residents than Chicago, twice as many as Washington, D.C., and 2.5 times more than Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. The question of whether Missouri's white males of military age, estimated to be at over 100,000 in number, would support the Union or the Confederacy was obviously critical. Although historians shy away from precise estimates, there is general agreement that many thousands of Missourians hoped to avoid the war and would have remained neutral had circumstances permitted. Evidence suggested thousands based their allegiance on whichever side was strongest in their immediate vicinity, changing allegiance with shifting winds of war. But overall, perhaps 60% favored the Union and 40% favored the Confederacy. Song and story have commemorated the service and sacrifices of Missourians who wore gray and the Missourians who wore blue, including more than 8,000 Missouri African Americans who entered the Union's Army or river-based Navy. Not so for Missouri's civilians. Mothers, wives, and sisters sent their sons, husbands, and brothers off to war with patriotic fervor. Bands played and musicians composed stirring march tunes commemorating the war's heroes. But early glamour quickly wore thin. Before the conflict ended, fully 1/3 of Missouri's population had become refugees, driven from their homes by both conventional military operations and a vicious guerrilla war. Springfield was not spared. It was a growing commercial regional center in 1860 with over 1,000 white residents inhabiting 266 dwellings. A majority of the town's citizens, as well as Greene County residents, were Unionists. Prominent Unionists included local businessmen Charles Shepard, Coralie B. Holland, and Benjamin Crabb, as well as John Phelps, who represented Missouri in the U.S. Congress for 16 successive years. Although a slaveholder, Phelps raised the regiment for the Union. Health problems, however, soon took him to St. Louis for recovery, leaving his wife Mary to manage their extensive farm which was just south of Springfield. You know the area today as Phelps Grove Park. Perhaps 40% of Greene County's residents supported the Southern cause. Springfield's prominent Confederates included Daniel Dorsey Berry, who was the wealthiest man and largest slaveholder in Greene County. His spacious and prosperous farm was just northeast of Springfield at a site known as Berry Spring, near present-day Drury University. War came to Springfield because of its position on an inland transportation corridor running from St. Louis to Rolla by rail, and then via unimproved country roads from Rolla to Springfield, and thence to Fayetteville and Fort Smith, Arkansas. Tens of thousands of northern and southern troops passed through Springfield as the two sides fought over the corridor, a struggle producing battles at Wilson's Creek, Pea Ridge, and Prairie Grove. By December 1862, Springfield was a major supply depot for the Union Army. Its immense stockpile of weapons, ammunition, food, and clothing, and its corrals filled with hundreds of Army horses and mules made it a tempting target for Confederate raiders. Forces led by John S. Marmaduke, Joseph O. Shelby, and Emmett McDonald attacked Springfield on January 8, 1863, only to find the town ably defended by General Egbert B. Brown and troops and local militia under his command. The Battle of Springfield was a Union victory, and after an indecisive engagement at Hartville on January 11th, the Confederate horsemen returned to Arkansas, from whence they had come. On March 10, 1863, in Batesville, Arkansas, James W. Ferris, one of the recently returned Confederate raiders, found time to send word to his home folk. I sit myself to inform you that I am well at present, hoping that these few lines find you all well and doing well. I suspect that you begin to think it a long time, and it seems a long time to me since I left home, he wrote. After a typical soldier's complaint about weather conditions, Ferris made a brief and very general reference to his participation the previous January in an event that historians would label Marmaduke's Raid. Ferris could not claim victory, but his comment reveals something of the spirit that would keep men like him devoted to their chosen cause until its desperate end. Referring to Marmaduke's raid in the Battle of Springfield, he simply wrote, "We was up as far as Springfield, but we was not strong enough. We could not go any farther north. We gave them thunder, though, while we was up there."
The rebels side, then they would let the Union slide. And that's what's the matter. But when the war had once begun, our party feeling soon was gone. We joined as brothers, everyone, and that's what's the matter. That's what's the matter. The rebels have to scatter. We'll make them flee by land and sea, and that's what's the matter.
Three of the historical pieces will have been written by young women who experienced the war in Springfield. Springfield's founding Campbell family was Tennessee-born, slave-holding, and well-off with plantations in Mississippi, a ranch in Texas, and their properties in Greene County, where they raised handsome horses. A young member of the clan, Eliza Kenny, granddaughter of the matriarch, Eliza Kenny, wife of John Paul Campbell, recounts her earliest memory of war. I shall never forget the strange feelings I had when I first saw real soldiers passing through the quiet streets of our little town. They were few in number, and not very soldierly, I suppose, being only the volunteers of the Union Home Guards, but they seemed to me quite warlike, and their fife and drum sounded as martial music should, a note that stirred my heart. I was excited without knowing why, as I ran with Will and all the colored children to see them march by. As I look back, I wonder why I understood so little of all that was surging around us. Perhaps Mother meant it so, and kept us as long as possible from hearing things that would have distressed us. But the time soon came when I knew clearly enough the meaning of North and South, and took my part in the stirring times. I am trying now to tell my story exactly as I remember it. After more than 30 years, I was not much over 12 years old. The first thing that seemed strange and awful to me that befell in July 1861 was a protracted meeting going on in the Christian church of which Mother was a member. These meetings were sometimes called basket revivals because of the well-filled hampers that accompanied the worshipers all day. This week in July was a time we children all looked forward to. Because of the picnicking in the grove adjacent to the church, Mother, Will, and I went to the church on this particular morning. The service passed quietly, but during the afternoon, there was suddenly a stir and excitement outside the church. Then, at the open doors and windows, we saw soldiers in blue uniforms. I do not recall any words or commands. Two men in the congregation arose and silently pointed out every man present who was a Southern sympathizer. I had not, at that moment, a very clear understanding of this scene, nor that these two men, our friends and neighbors, were now our enemies. Then a tall officer stepped forward with a paper in his hand, which he read aloud. For the first time, seeing Mother's sad, set face beside me, I realized that it was a serious occasion. All Southern sympathizers, men and women, were directed to come to the public square. The men were put under guard, and the women and children straggled along beside them. When we reached the square, each adult was required to take the oath of allegiance or remain a prisoner. Then followed a trying time. The town was full of German soldiers belonging to Siegel's command. They were not very well behaved, and at last became so troublesome and rude that Mother complained to General Sweeney, who was in command of the federal troops in Springfield. He was kind and attentive, and said that if we would give room to 2 of his staff officers, they would see that her property was protected. It was hard to get good quarters for the officers at this time. Colonel Mills and Major Spencer came at once. Colonel Mills was a stern, dignified officer who never unbent to join in the family life. But Major Spencer was always pleasant, and evidently thought it no breach of patriotism to make himself agreeable to those around him. We all liked him, and I think he became a real friend to Mother the day before the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Colonel Mills told Mother that he would bring General Lyon and some of his staff to dinner. She agreed and saw at once to the preparation of one of those dinners for which she was famous. General Lyon was a rough-looking man with good manners. He sat at Mother's right and opposite to me. During dinner, he raised his wine glass to Mother and said, "Madam, you wish us success?" "Sir," she answered with grave dignity, "I am a Southern woman." He looked at her in amazement and said, "And have you sons in the Confederacy?" Mother's fine gray eyes were dark with trouble as she made answer, "4. And then with a flash of spirit, "And I wish they were 50 and I were leading them." Some at table smiled, and our friend Major Spencer twinkled at me. But General Lyon arose and took her hand as he said, "I hope no trouble is at hand for so brave a woman." He was killed the next day, and we never saw Colonel Mills or Major Spencer again.
On December 29, 1862, Major General Thomas C. Hindman, the ranking Confederate commander in northern Arkansas, and his chief of staff, Robert C. Newman, sent a telegram to Brigadier General John Sappington Marmaduke, who led the cavalry division in Hindman's Trans-Mississippi Army. The telegram read, General Hindman directs that if your command is in a condition to operate, you should move by way of Frog Bayou, Huntsville Road, or by way of Yellville, and attack the enemy by flank and rear, or make a demonstration in that way. It is very desirable that this be done, and if you attempt it, you will operate without further instructions from here. Marmaduke was an experienced commander and fought in many battles, and he seems to have been untroubled by the vagueness of his orders. As he later reported, he understood his objective to be to relieve pressure on Hindman, who had recently been defeated at the Battle of Prairie Grove, Arkansas, on December 7, 1862, by frightening the Federals into sending troops back to Missouri. His resources consisted of horsemen under his direct command at Lewisburg, Arkansas, as well as a force encamped at Pocahontas, Arkansas, 155 miles northeast, commanded by Colonel Joseph C. Porter. The obvious target to accomplish this mission was the St. Louis-Fort Smith corridor. What troubled him was the condition of his command. His 3,400 men were, as he put it in his report, indifferently armed and equipped, thinly clad, many without shoes. Fully 800 men lacked horses, and another 200 had mounts that were unfit for service, reducing his effective command to 2,400. But effective is a relative term, for Marmaduke reported that even these men were riding horses worn out by continued and active service of many months. Horses that were, for the most part, unshod, very poor, and unfit for any service. These were not conditions that promised success or even suggested that it was likely. But Marmaduke was not a man to flinch at long odds when the Confederate fortunes in the Trans-Mississippi were in such peril. How best to carry out Hindman's instructions? A move via Huntsville, Arkansas might allow the Confederates to strike the Union Army supply base at Prairie Grove, but that would risk running into one or more contingents of the Federal Army of the frontier. Better to move further east and strike deep into Missouri, threatening the Union Army supply line where the Federals were spread thin. Marmaduke's raiders began their trek north to Missouri by moving in several columns. This was due to their locations when orders arrived and the need to forage along the way. Marmaduke led one column in person. His chief subordinate was Colonel Joseph Orville Shelby, whose brigade was about 1,600 strong. The Confederates left their camps near Lewisburg on December 31st. Writing a history of Shelby's men after the war, Shelby's adjutant, John Newman Edwards, depicted a unit that, despite the defeat at Prairie Grove, was eager to return to Missouri at a moment's notice. He wrote, "The brigade had been resting in camp at Lewisburg when a whisper ran through the tents like the jarring of a nerve that a march to Missouri was indicated. These merry madcaps had ever a passionate yearning for such desperate forays." Perhaps. But given the brigade's dilapidated condition, it is more likely that the men questioned their leader's sanity. The troopers had experienced but little rest, and after a brief bit of sunshine, the weather turned against them. Cold and rain, fatigue, poor rations, and thin clothing do not merry madcaps make. It's not clear how many days' rations the Confederates carried with them starting out, but they did not take wagons or a pack train in support. The food the troopers tucked into their semi-waterproof cloth haversacks could not have lasted much longer than 3 days. Men might skip meals, of course, but even assuming a starvation ration of 1.5 pounds of food daily, it meant that the initial rations were consumed. Marmaduke's raiders were going to have to scavenge, confiscate, purchase, or steal an average of 944 pounds of food daily, while still advancing as quickly as possible. And this had to come from civilians they were passing by. This is nothing, however, compared to the food needed for their horses. In theory, horses might be ridden to exhaustion and replaced with captured stock, but Marmaduke was not passing through a region noted for breeding horses. Even stolen animals have to eat, however. It took a horse several hours a day to acquire the nutrition necessary for hard work from grazing, and the raiders had little time to spare. Army regulations specified that each horse received 26 pounds of food a day, half in grain and half in forage. Logistical challenge was equally great for the 825 men under Colonel Porter at Pocahontas, who received orders from the raid on January 2nd, 1863, and began the brigade's move immediately. Marmaduke ordered Porter to rendezvous with him at Hartville, Missouri, on January 9th. From Lewisburg, Marmaduke's column moved north over the Boston Mountains to Yellville. They made good time during the first 2 days, the weather being warm and pleasant. Then it began to rain. Major Edwards, the adjutant who wrote Shelby's after-action report, left a dramatic description of conditions. Shelby's brigade, he wrote, marched through the grand old mountains standing bare against the dull, somber sky, with heavy storm clouds of the centuries lowering overhead. For 3 days of cold and continuous rain, the men endured harsh weather, without a murmur, although the sky was dark and threatening. Poetic license aside, the men were miserable. Conditions were no better for Porter, although Porter left fewer details of his column's march. The roads were rough, and Porter had no way to replace lost horses. As he approached the Missouri line, he was forced to send 125 men back because their worn-out mounts could not take them any further. But morale remained high. The men of my command, he wrote, seemed well satisfied, and all things went well, notwithstanding the hardships all were compelled to undergo, on account of shortages of provisions and clothing. When Marmaduke's column reached Forsyth, Missouri, on the banks of the White River, the community was nearly deserted, with the exception of a few elderly men whom Edwards labeled Rip Van Winkles. Suddenly, according to Edwards' memoirs, a handsome country girl rejoicing in all the coquetry of a yellow bodice and white muslin dress greeted the raiders with violent demonstrations of affection. She fawned over Marmaduke to excess and stood by his side while he enjoyed a supper of ham and eggs with sorghum molasses. Whether the other officers, much less the common soldiers, received anything is not recorded. On January 6, Marmaduke's men made camp along Beaver Creek, north of Forsyth in Taney County. That evening, Marmaduke received valuable intelligence that would reshape the course of the raid and the conduct of the action thereafter. From scouts and other resources he recalled, I learned that Springfield, with its rich army stores, was weakly garrisoned, though strongly fortified, and if surprised, I thought it could be captured. I determined to attack it. By other sources, Marmaduke meant spies, although the number and identity he employed remains unknown. His decision made sense, however. The supplies in Springfield were critical to federal operations in Arkansas, and their destruction offered Marmaduke the best hope of causing the federal withdrawal from northwest Arkansas. There was also the prospect of capturing warm winter clothing and enough food to provide the men and horses with full rations. Even more enticing was the fact that Springfield, as the Army's remount and rehabilitation station for southwest Missouri, was home to many hundreds of healthy, well-fed, and properly shod horses. Marmaduke immediately sent couriers to locate Porter and redirect his column to Springfield as quickly as possible. But as it turned out, these couriers never located Porter, who continued on schedule to Hartville. As a result, Marmaduke would fight at Springfield without Porter's help. John Marmaduke's decision on January 6, 1863 to strike Springfield meant that there would be a test of the leadership skills of Brigadier General Egbert Benson Brown, commander of the Union's military Southwest District of Missouri, and therefore Springfield's defender. Federal scouts operating south of Springfield detected the Confederate approach and brought word to Brown on the afternoon of January 7th. They reported erroneously that Marmaduke had between 3,000 and 6,000 men. Brown then called together his subordinates and staff. Within the town, the Federals had one Green volunteer unit, the 18th Iowa Infantry, and 2 veteran militia regiments, the 3rd and 4th Missouri State Militia Cavalry, for a total of only 1,120 men. If Marmaduke really possessed 6,000 men, the Federals faced frightening odds of 6 to 1 against them. Brown's lower estimate of no more than 3,000 Confederates still meant odds of 3 to 1. The situation was certainly perilous, if not grim. Brown and his subordinates therefore discussed 2 options. First, the Federals could torch Springfield, stockpile military resources, and withdraw without a fight. But if they did so, the Division of the Army of the Frontier operating across the border in northwest Arkansas would lose its winter supplies and might be forced to retreat. As a second option, they might organize a defense and hope that the Union militia, summoned from the immediate neighborhood, would reach Springfield before the town was attacked. For some of the officers present, the options discussed had personal as well as professional import. Brigadier General Coralie B. Holland, the 4th Enrolled Missouri Militia District Commander, and Colonel Henry Shepard, commander of the 72nd Enrolled Missouri Militia, were longtime residents of Springfield. Since the military supplies in question had been stored in nearly every business and vacant home in Springfield, their preemptive destruction would likely spark a conflagration that would destroy the entire town. Shepard immediately argued for making a stand against Marmaduke. Encouraged by this determination and confident in the men under his command, Brown agreed that the defense was the best choice. That decided, Holland did his best to protect the town. Between 6 and 7 p.m., he sent messengers ordering the enrolled Missouri militia in Greene and nearby Cedar, Dade, Lawrence, Polk, and Webster counties to Springfield. As Brown struggled to organize his defense, Dr. Samuel Henry Melcher offered a creative suggestion. As medical director for the currently scattered Army of the Frontier, Melcher made Springfield his headquarters, and he knew that the town had two things in abundance: weapons and hospital patients. He therefore recommended that Brown arm those among the over 1,000 hospital convalescents who were willing to join the defenders and able to walk at least short distances. Moreover, he volunteered to sweep through the hospitals with patriotic words and get as many men out of their bunks as possible. Some 300 men responded to Melcher's pleas, and the hospital patients turned soldiers were soon nicknamed the Quinon Brigade. It was hardly encouraging that many of Springfield's Unionist civilians were in an absolute state of panic. It was a night of excitement, alarm, and terror, to be sure, one observer recalled. Some citizens packed their traps and betook themselves to houses of relatives and friends in the country. Others fled from the exposed situation to the public square. Still others went to their cellars. All hid their money and valuables. For the small number of openly pro-Confederate civilians still residing in Springfield, however, the future looked promising. One of them later recalled that from lip to lip the message had run that Marmaduke was coming, and that with him were some of the Greene County boys that were wearing gray. The ladies of that day were almost universally violent partisans from one side or the other, and they were especially demonstrative at this time, expressing their glee and their dissatisfaction with the prospect of the coming battle. Anticipating a quick capture of Springfield by Marmaduke's raiders, pro-Confederate women began cooking meals to serve to the Southern soldiers. Shortly after midnight, the first militiamen from outlying areas reached Springfield in response to Brown's call. Numbering between 200 and 300 men, they were members of the 72nd Regiment and 74th Regiment of the Enrolled Missouri Militia. These men had been lying around loose in the Greene counties of Greene, Lawrence, and other areas. With few exceptions, they were not uniformed, and most arrived unarmed. But they had responded at a moment's notice and assembled at the scene of the crisis as designers of the militia system and intending. There were plenty of weapons to be distributed to them. On the morning of January 8th, as the sun came up over the horizon, casting off the gloom of the previous afternoon and evening, the sun glistened on the frosty ground as some Missouri State Cavalry, previously stationed in Ozark, came galloping into town. Their officers confirmed that Marmaduke's Confederates had reached Ozark the night before, had destroyed a blockhouse and supplies there, and were definitely following the Federal cavalry as they retired to Springfield. Early on the morning of January 8th, Marmaduke's column passed into sparsely timbered terrain that covered much of the land south of Springfield. They halted at Goose Pond, a large watering hole more than 3 miles from the town itself. There the icy water slaked the thirst of the cavalrymen and their horses. Marmaduke and his staff used the time to interrogate a few Federal soldiers whom they had captured en route. One prisoner stated that Springfield had almost 2,000 defenders, while another stated there were 13 regiments, approximately 6,500 men, garrisoning the town and supplying the unit's names. Marmaduke and Shelby were experienced leaders, having been the eyes and ears of Hindman's army, so they were accustomed to sifting through conflicting information. Even so, such a huge discrepancy regarding the number of Federals in Springfield underscores the fog of war within which Marmaduke had to reach decisions. To attack without quarter would be risky, but Marmaduke waited no longer. He ordered Shelby to advance, and after a brief repositioning of troops, the Confederate line swept forward. It was about 10 a.m. on January 8, 1863, when the Battle of Springfield began.
Dr. Piston mentioned that one of the reasons why Marmaduke raided southwest Missouri was to relieve the Union occupation of northwest Arkansas, and part of that occupation was a result of one of the few unambiguous Union victories in the Trans-Mississippi area, the Battle at Blue Ridge. And here we have a piece celebrating it.
From the March 3, 1863 issue of the Cavalier, a newspaper in Yorktown, Virginia. Yorktown, Virginia was at that time in Union hands. Title of the article, Battle of Springfield, Missouri, as seen by a Yankee girl. Springfield, January 18, 1863. Dear friend, your letter was received yesterday evening. No doubt you have thought of me several times since the memorable 8th and wondered how I took the battle. Therefore, I will proceed to particularize. I will first inform you that about the 15th of November, Mrs. John S. Phelps received news that her husband was very ill at the Planter's house in St. Louis and left Springfield for that city. It being very lonely for me at the Phelps place and having a number of musical scholars, I came to town to board at Colonel Shepard's. Colonel S. is a wealthy merchant, formerly a resident of Philadelphia and one of the prominent men of the Southwest. He owns a fine house about half a mile east of town, is colonel of the 72nd Volunteer Militia, and a staunch Unionist, but not for abolition. Mrs. S. is a fine lady, and her 2 little girls are almost angelic. I teach them music and English studies. Well, on the night of January 7th, Colonel S. announced at the tea table that his scouts, arriving from different directions, reported the enemy 5,000 strong about 20 miles distant, rapidly advancing on Springfield. He was up all night, sending runners out for his men who were enjoying the holidays at their own homes. The rebels were advancing from the southeast. To defend Springfield, Brigadier General Brown had the state militia, numbering about 1,000, and skeletons of regiments left sick at the hospitals where the main body of the army had moved. Thursday morning, General Brown managed to arrange men in the best manner possible. Springfield was in the utmost confusion and alarm. Every citizen capable of shouldering a gun was considered a man of the greatest importance. About 11 o'clock, the pickets stationed a short distance this side of the Phelps place were driven in. At 12 o'clock, Colonel S. came to dinner. He told Mrs. S. and myself that we had better pack our trunks, and if obliged to leave, to go out into the country 2 or 3 miles. I may, he said, sleep at home tonight in safety. You may not see me again for months, perhaps never. Don't be alarmed until after you have heard the 3rd cannon. He left us, and not long after the 1st cannon was fired, the 2nd and the 3rd. At precisely 1 o'clock, the battle commenced, 8th of January, 1863. What a glorious day! Not cold or bleak, as I had often known January in dear New England. No snow had fallen. Even Jack Frost had made us but few visits. It seemed more like the calm days we have in November, when the leaves were falling, dying and rustling over the still green grass. I was not frightened. I did not cry, though tears would have been a relief. But inexpressible anguish came on my heart as I listened to the roar of cannon. Bullets, grape-shot, and shell were flying in all directions. The barbarians had commenced shelling the place without a word of warning. An enemy 5,000 strong under Marmaduke, Shelby, and McDonald against 1,500 Federals. From the veranda of the 2nd story, I saw the rebels moving in long lines, emerging from the thickets and underbrush about half a mile distant. I could distinctly see their batteries. About 4 o'clock, a messenger came in saying General Brown was wounded. The enemy had driven our men back and were fighting with desperation. I knew from their unearthly yells that they were gaining on us. There were about 30 women and children in the house beside Colonel S.'s family. Some were wringing their hands and crying, "Oh God, spare my husband," or "That cannon," or "Oh dear, that shell perhaps will strike him." I was thankful I had no husband to be used as a target on that day. Whichever way I turned, the faces were looking at me filled with despair, and groans from anxious hearts only replied to my words of comfort. At 5 o'clock, an orderly came in, saying Colonel S. was well. His men ordered to the right front, a dangerous situation, in the thickest of the fight. He was cheering on his men to make another ground rally, where the enemy would soon have possession of the place. A company of the 18th Iowa, together with the militia, made a splendid charge, which sent the rebels whirling back to their position. The enemy had taken possession of the college building. By this time, they had come to almost hand-to-hand fighting. The rebels, secreted in bushes, behind fences and trees, would fire and then roll over from their position to reload and fire again with great expertness. One rebel battery was planted behind a widow's house. She was lying in the middle of the floor with her children covered with feather beds for protection, shot and shell passing through the house. One shell exploded in the room, but did no harm. I thought at sundown the firing would cease, and I did know old Saul was never before so long in making his exit behind the tall trees. But when he finally departed, there was no cessation in the fighting. We heard no news until 7 o'clock, when Colonel S., with several other officers, came in. He said, "They are repulsed, for a time at least. We shall be ready for them when the moon rises. Some of my men are killed and many wounded. Our fellows fought splendidly." It was decided that if the rebels were victorious in another attack, the commissary store, the arsenal, and public property generally should be burned to ashes. Trains of powder, timber, and matches were in readiness, so at any moment of the night we looked for Springfield to go up in flames. Colonel S. came home in the night and said it was his opinion that the enemy was retreating. The scene Friday was more excitable if possible than Thursday. The enemy had gone round to attack us, we supposed, on the east. But by 1 o'clock, there was no attack. News came about 3 o'clock that the enemy had made good their retreat. It seemed almost a miracle how they had been repulsed by a handful of militia. Colonel Shepard and General Holland covered themselves in glory. Now I will proceed to tell you what they did at Mrs. Phelps' farm. As the enemy came to town, they would, of course, pass her plantation. The white man and woman in charge of affairs there, as soon as they heard the secession were coming, gathered up their little bedding and took 2 large oil paintings that hung in Mr. Phelps' office. The enemy appeared in the field at the back of the house before they left. The servants all came to town also. Saturday afternoon after the battle, I obtained a pass to go out there. Was told, however, if not absolutely necessary, I ought not to go. I went, and the pickets this side of the place told me that the house was full of secession wounded. I saw the servants at their quarters first, and George, the chief of the servants, walked up the path with me to the house. 6 men were standing on the front piazza. I approached them and said, "I don't know whether you are rebels or Union men, but I belong here, and I've come to take charge of what remains." "Oh, yes, ma'am, certainly we are feds," they said. I cannot describe to you the state of confusion everything was in. Such a general upturning and overhauling and ransacking has been through the house. The bureau drawers containing Mrs. P.'s fine summer clothing have been taken out and their contents strewn on the floor. Her box of jewelry containing some elegant bracelets, rings, pins, etc., her massive silver pitchers, spoons, and knives and forks were gone. Sealed cans of fruit, nowhere to be found. Hams had disappeared from the smokehouse. A barrel of sugar and salt, 2 barrels of mackerel, all taken. Empty bottles were lying over the floor in nearly every room. Beds were relieved of blankets, quilts, and sheets. Even dishes from cupboards were taken down, broken, and scattered over the floor. I gathered up her summer dresses and all the linen I could find, together with my own clothes, which had hung in the wardrobe, and brought them into town. I told the Negroes not to leave the place, and that the next day I would send some white people to govern. The Confederates did not disturb the library, which was very valuable. They took Miss Mary Phelps' fine $40 saddle and velvet riding habit, however. Mrs. Phelps' buggy was found in the brush the day after the battle, with 2 of her counterpanes in a silver coffee pot. I was rejoiced that the house was not burned. They have suffered severely before this. The rebels have passed away to Dixie, and I do not believe they will get off easily if they make a second attempt. The bravery of the militia saved us. General Brown is doing well. I saw the mini ball that was taken from his arm. Some portions of the bone are also out. His headquarters are next to Colonel Shepard's. Now I've written you a description and a half. If you get tired and think the first sheet stupid, just burn the second.
As you can see, we are interested in giving you the literate aspects of individuals who have experienced the war, not within the official way, but the way indeed that civilians do. And now, I shall read to you the history of a piano. Aspiring to gentility, Springfield's early settlers valued their parlor instruments, the piano especially. The Prussian-born John Baptiste Biederlinden is often called the town's first music teacher, and his granddaughter, Minna Biederlinden Quinn, writes in a memoir, all the town's pioneers brought their children for lessons to him. Among his pupils were the daughters of Mrs. Patty Fulbright, Mrs. Judith Hubble, Mrs. Gabrielle Roundtree, Mrs. James Vaughn, Mrs. Rush Campbell, Owen, his own 3 daughters, and many others. It was a handsome instrument, that's a photo of it, for which he paid $500 in the 1850s. That would have been an enormous sum. Getting it to Springfield was no easy matter. It was shipped to Rolla, which was the railroad terminus. Being too large for a 2-horse wagon, a hay frame was half loaded with hay, the piano placed in it, carefully covered with blankets and more hay, and freighted to the house in Springfield. Now, according to my colleague John Rutherford, that circle right there with that green line is pointing is where the house was situated, where it was found. And the reason why that is important is because that is a site of the battle. South Street was a place of significant battle. So be aware of the fact that this piano is going to be subject to wartime activity. Exempt from military service, Mr. Biederlinden held himself strictly neutral and was friendly with the officers of both armies. And now I quote from the narrative, from Minna's narrative. During the Civil War, a large colonial-type house across the street from the Biederlinden home was used as headquarters by whichever army occupied the city. A large room in the house was used as a guest room. It was a regular rendezvous for the lonesome officers and soldiers. Many of them were better or worse musicians. Some could play the piano. Others, the small instruments kept on hand for use in teaching: violin, guitar, cello, flute, accordion. And they found much entertainment. One officer, Colonel Snodgrass, boarded with the family. He played the flute. And with this piano under the skillful fingers of Molly C., the eldest Biederlinden daughter, they furnished much pleasure and comfort to the homesick soldiers. During Marmaduke's raid on the city, January 8, 1863, the house was turned into a barricade. The piano, or rather the family and many of the household goods, were put into a large cellar under an outhouse. The piano was too large for that storage, and so it was hastily wrapped in bedclothes and set out in the garden. When the raid was over, the parents came back to look around. There were many dead men about. General C.B. Holland of the Home Guards came hurrying to them and begged Mrs. Biederlinden to go back, saying this was no scene for her eyes. She was plenty plucky. And they kept on toward the piano. As they advanced, they came to the body of a slain officer lying on his face. Mr. Biederlinden turned him over. It was Colonel Snodgrass, their late boarder. The piano was uninjured and was soon back to its accustomed place in the house, again sounding forth the scales and arpeggios of pupils.
An excerpt from the report that Marmaduke submitted to his superior commander, Major General Thomas C. Hyman. Headquarters, 4th Division, 1st Corps, Trans-Mississippi Department, Stateville, Arkansas, January 18, 1863. In obedience to instructions, I marched from Lewisburg, Arkansas, December 31, 1862, via Yellville, Arkansas, to strike the enemy in rear or flank, with 1,600 men under Colonel Joseph Shelby and 270 men under Colonel Emmett McDonald, supported by Colonel Joseph C. Porter with 600 men. McDonald surprised and captured and burned Fort Lawrence on Beaver Creek, Missouri. Of its garrison, killed 10, captured 17, and routed the rest, about 250. Captured 200 horses, 300 standing arms, 10 wagons, and a quantity of quartermasters and commissary stores. Shelby captured and burned the fort at Ozark. The garrison fled. With Shelby and McDonell, I attacked Springfield, Missouri, and after 8 hours of hard fighting, driving the Yankees before me and into their strongholds, I captured one piece of artillery, a 6-pounder, a stockade fort, and a large part of the town. At dark, the fighting ceased. The greater part of the town, the fort, and many of the dead and wounded Federals were in my possession. The Federal force was 4,200 strong. My loss was 20 killed and 80 wounded. Yankee loss much greater. I did not deem it best to renew the attack, and the next day marched towards Raleigh. The Federals scattered and fled before me. I burned the forts at Sand Springs and Marshfield. After passing Marshfield, I formed a junction with Porter, who had burned the forts at Hartville and Hazelwood. All the forts burned were well-built works, generally large blockhouses with stockade and good earthworks around, so strong that 100 brave men, well armed, could defy 1,000 infantry or cavalry. After joining Porter, I marched southeasterly, making my way toward Arkansas. At Hartville, I met, fought, and drove in the direction of Lebanon 1,500 infantry and 500 cavalry under Brigadier General Samuel Merrill. The battle was desperate. My loss was 15 killed and 70 wounded. Of the former was the brave McDonell, Lieutenant Colonel John Wimmer, and Major George Kirtley, and other many brave officers and men. The Federal loss was also heavy. The enemy sent in a flag of truce to bury their dead. At this place, I captured a caisson with ammunition, a number of small arms, and about 150 greatcoats, which the Yankees left as they ran off. I continued my march and reached here today. Will tomorrow morning commence crossing the White River at this place and 12 miles below. Both men and horses are worn out and need rest. A detailed report of the expedition I will forward at the earliest moment. Respectfully, John S. Marmaduke, Brigadier General Commanding, Headquarters, 4th Division, Trans-Mississippi Department. Addendum, written in February. The expedition was an extremely hazardous and trying one. On leaving Lewisburg and Pocahontas, the men were indifferently armed and equipped, thinly clad, many without shoes and horses, marched without baggage wagons or cooking utensils, carrying all they had on their horses, and subsisting as best they could on the country through which they marched. The horses were worn by continued and active service of many months, and were for the most part unshod, very poor, and unfit for any service. At least 200 of the command abandoned their horses on the roadside to die, and waded many a weary mile through snow and deep mud, some barefooted, yet they encountered every danger willingly, and endured all fatigues cheerfully. In conclusion, I think I may safely state that the object of the expedition was fully accomplished, and more. Union forces in Arkansas countermarched rapidly to save Springfield. A long chain of forts, strong in themselves, built at great expense and labor, which overawed and kept in subjection the country, were razed to the ground, and the heart of the people revived again at the presence of Confederate troops.
origin, may I tell you what? I know what you have been. I am not jealous, oh no, no, but it's a shame and sin. Your bosom friend, young Jones, just left, he calls here every night. I'm sure it if were not for him, I'd really die of fright. I'm sure if it were not for him, I'd really die of fright.
Oh, Mary Brown, I'll call him out to fight. So Mr. Jones was here, you say, while I have been away. Now, madam, you will drive me mad. We part this very day. You know it is my business, ma'am, that keeps me here at store. And if I could have sooner come, I'd been here long before. You know it is my business, ma'am, that keeps me at the store. Oh, Mary Brown, it's business at the store.
Then don't be angry, husband, don't. I'm sure I love you, dear. I was but joking when I said that odious Jones was here. But promise me now, won't you, love, that when the night has come, you'll never stay away so late and leave your wife at home.
I promise you when night has come, I'll always stay at home. Oh, Mary Brown, I'll always stay at home. You were but joking, dearest wife, now come and kiss me too. Jones is a bosom friend to me, but needn't be to you. My little wife, my joy and life, my gentle, pretty elf. If anyone sits up with you, hereafter it's myself. If anyone sits up with you, hereafter it's myself. Oh, Mary Brown, we'll never quarrel more.
Can you see that even that piece was of a sort of civil war? Perhaps in more domestic settings. We've come to the official end of the planned part of our program. I wanted to take an opportunity to ask our musicians who interpreted the music in their performance, but perhaps might have some words to explain to us what they saw in it. For again, much of this music, obviously not the Foster music. The Foster music is our own cultural possession. We all proudly own it. And when I asked my colleague Ann Marie Daehn if she would participate in an event like this, her response was, Stephen Foster? Yeah. And so indeed, this is a celebration of the beauty of the art as well as of the sorrows of the war. I'd like to ask Ethan, and after this I would open, I believe we have some time to do some Q&A. In that case, let me start by asking Ethan what he saw in the music he was playing, because again, I have suggested that you probably are the first person in 100 years to put your fingers onto the keyboard, onto that music. So I'm curious what your opinion, what your experience was.
Well, the first thing that came to mind with pretty much all of the pieces, except for maybe the last one, the Bugle March, was that they were written by somebody who is very much involved with band music. You know, even in you know, piano sonatas by Beethoven, for example. It's great piano stuff that really only works that well on a piano. Nonetheless, you can really assign an instrument to it. And that same principle was totally present here with these pieces, especially the first two, first three, right? Yeah, especially horns, and just, you know, it seemed a lot of times like there was a solo orchestral relationship between everything that was happening. So, yeah, that was the main impression.
Would you mind standing up?
Ah, sure.
Yes, okay.
Can I add to that? Just because I'm sure the rest of you heard this too. I think you're absolutely right. But how many people heard opera? How many people heard Donizetti? You know, where you have these beautiful melodies, there's Chopin there, there's John Field's in there, and the precursor to Arthur Sullivan, of course, the great Gilbert and Sullivan, who you know, mimicked opera composers. And so I would say that there's a lot of that in there as well. The other thing that I would say of pretty much all the Foster and some of the marches to a degree is, remember, it's somewhat simplistic approach because they wanted people to do it, right? The marches not so much, but Stephen Foster's accompaniments are fairly simple. Not that, you know, I want to talk down to a graduate student, but they're fairly approachable, and so are the tunes, you know. Some of the tunes that we did today, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, the song that I sang earlier, those are not as well known because, you know, it's not Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair or Camptown Races, which were much more popular. I do like that. I read something recently where Spike Jones had his own version of Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair, but he called it Jeannie with the Light Blue Jeans. That was kind of funny. But yeah, I just wanted to add that because I definitely heard, I don't want to say parody, but of opera in some of those marches.
No, Ethan, I don't want you to sit down just yet
Okay.
because you said all the pieces except for Hermann Scholz.
Yeah, the last one.
And so, can we just go back to that one for a second?
Yeah, the bugle
And, the bugle march.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Now, my assumption about this piece is that it would have been performed at a trooping at some point for Fremont's hussars. In other words, that this would have at some point, clearly after the Battle of Springfield, I would assume, but that we could have assumed that this would have been performed at a trooping of colors in Springfield. That is my assumption. I cannot prove it, but I think it's quite likely that the extent to which you have a regimental band, and as you say, it's a reflection of people who are doing band music, piano transcriptions, for example, for band music. So Hermann Scholz is the leader of a regimental band. So to that extent, clearly he is writing something here that imitates that. And I'm curious if in the song itself you see where these commands are written, if they're reflected, like the bugle call. I wish that we had the ability to do commence fire. And maybe if we ever get a chance to, yeah, where is commence fire?
So, let's see. So as you probably heard, in between the thicker musical sections of this piece, there's these kind of single melody, programmatic type of, horn calls. Yeah, so commence firing was the third one, which is this.
By the way, I would like to tell you something. Herman, what is the name of the prison in St. Louis? Is Gravion?
Gratiot is what it is.
Gratiot, okay.
Gratiot Street Prison.
You did not want to wind up there. That was one of the sorrowful places on earth. Hermann Scholz wound up in that prison because he was accused of stealing silver band instruments. So he wasn't a very good band leader. It turns out that he embezzled some of their properties. Just to point out, not everyone who's a good musician is a good musician. Ethan, I'm sure that's not true for you. We are open. My colleague, Dr. Piston, is the only person who knows more than has been said. I have told you everything I know. And so, to that extent, if you have any questions to address to anyone, please do so. We are energized by the music and the reading, and so I think we still have to come down a little bit. Questions and answers are a good way to do so. Ma'am.
I want to know, is the Henry Shepherd home, does it still exist, and where was it exactly, if it doesn't exist?
Let's see. Well, without looking it up, we gave a precise street corner in the book, so buy the book and you'll know. Would be nice. But what I'm really saying is I'm embarrassed that I don't remember exactly, but briefly, not far from Kentwood Arms, in that general area. And this is the house as it looked after the war, when a very Victorian tower had been added to it. So this is not a Civil War appearance. And the veranda from which she watched the battle is probably in the back of the house. So I don't remember the exact corner, but in the neighborhood of Kentwood Arms.
But nothing of it exists anymore. Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, what knowledge do you have of Fort Sand Springs?
Other than what is written in the book, which is just a very most general description, that it was not a very substantial fort at all, very quite flimsy. I don't have any information, although it was not ever my goal, to write a definitive history of what is just a small part of this. So I don't remember encountering any documents that would give a deeper history of that, but as I said, it's possible. But it was not much of a fort. In writing his after-action report, of course, Marmaduke presented every fort they captured and burned as a very formidable object. And some of them, such as the palisades surrounding the courthouse at Hartville, which he didn't mention, were apparently just very, very flimsy. So that's the best answer I can give. Other questions? Myself or anyone? I certainly want to express my thanks to the musicians and thank you all. Not a musician, but as someone who in the course of my career has seen and encountered lots of Civil War sheet music, for that matter, lots of military music, and not being able to play them, it was a real pleasure to hear them. And as you may know, at this time period, the sheet music's where the money is. Yes. You can make some money performing, just like nowadays, only a few people make the sheet music. If you hit it, you got a hit. That's how you make your money is the sheet music.
Although I will say that Stephen Foster, he was kind of the first composer trying to make a career of being a composer, and he died with 37 cents to his name because the copyright laws were not very enforceable or existent. So, Stephen Foster did not.
And publishers always rip you off, right?
Oh, absolutely. No, the publisher did great.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, actually, it's publishing stuff is where the music.
Absolutely, yeah.
Some of this music, I believe, was composed and ready to have an occasion slapped on it as a cover. I hate to say that, but the fact, for example, we were talking, Ethan, for example, about a quartet that was composed, a vocal quartet. That was an elegy to General Price, in which neither General Price nor the Battle of Wilson's Creek is ever mentioned. Right? Honor, glory, revenge, all those things is mentioned. But you would think that a song dedicated to the fallen general would at least mention his name. And so when you have this piece come out in like 1861 and he passed away in 1861, do you understand I'm trying to do the math?
Yeah.
So we can't overestimate the role that music plays in the sentiment of the Civil War. And I think to that extent, this represents for us something that we need to revisit on occasion. That there's much that we remember and much that we have studied, and if we look at the Civil War in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, then I'd like to suggest that one of the ways that people on the other side of the Mississippi understood what was going on were obviously through media, right? Things like Harper's Weekly, things like this sheet music, which would bring attention to events on the other side of the Mississippi and do so in home parlors, which is the center of domestic life. Yes?
I just, this is a little bit off of that, but you talk about music for the sense of what's going on. I watched a thing on TV just a couple of nights ago with Tony Orlando and Don, and they were doing tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. I mean, does that not tell you what was going on when that came out?
It does. One more question? One more? Well, I think we've all been having questions. So thank you.